there's a problem. Plague Doctor outfits did exist, but they never looked like this. And they weren't used during the Black Death either. So what did they look like, and where did they come from? Well, the Black Death went on from 1346 to 53 and killed 30 to 50% of Europe's population. But this event was only the start of a much longer plague pandemic. Anyway, the 1600s, that's an important century for this story, because the Plague Doctor costume, which would have looked more like this, was invented in 1619 by a French dude named Charles Delors as a sort of early hazmat suit. And from then on, they were mainly used in France and Italy. But what caused the transition from goofy little guy to it's not a phase mob? The answer, unironically, is edgy humor. Meet Dr. Schnabel. You can thank Paul Fast for this one. He was the very German guy who created this thing in 1656, using classic German humor, first as intentionally mocking Italian doctors for dressing in such a frightening and macabre outfit. He notes how alien this look would have been to the German people, and goes further in calling out these Italian plague doctors, mocking their greed. He exaggerates certain details like the gloves with claws, and the stick with a bat-winged hourglass on the end, both inventions of the imagination. But from then on, this image just sort of stuck, and eventually this would evolve into the steampunk Birdman plague doctor thing we have today. With that said, Fast does give us some interesting stuff, corroborated by other sources, about the real plague doctor outfits. As it turns out, the outfit may have actually worked decently well. Their robes were waxed and offered near complete body coverage, which would have protected them from fleas and coughs and sneezes that spread the plague. Hello? Salut? Why do they have the beak? Oh, the beak. Well, that was all about the miasma, baby. Wait, what's that? Well, at the time, it was the leading theory on how diseases were spread. It's the idea that bad, foul-smelling air caused disease. So the beaks were like pouches, stuffed with dried flowers and herbs and other good-smelling things that would, in theory, counter the bad air that caused the plague. Of course, we all know that it was actually those nasty, big, black rats spreading the plague, right? Right? We may have misjudged the rats. You see, our understanding of how plague is spread only really formed once germ theory became widely accepted in the 1880s and 1890s, and we realized the plague was caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Now, the plague is still around today, but the strain of bacteria that causes it has only been around since the 1850s, so it's a different strain from the one that caused the Black Death 500 years earlier in the 1340s and 50s. This modern strain is largely spread by rats and fleas, and for a long time we assumed that the version of the plague that was around during the Black Death was spread the same way. A lot of our current research, though, is saying that this scary, big, black rat was likely not the main spreader of plague during the Black Death. So, what's to blame? Well, look at these 9 real-life outbreaks of the plague. Confused? So was I, until I was enlightened, by Dean Attell. Let me share this with you. In their 2018 paper, they looked at these 9 outbreaks and ran a bunch of computer simulations to see what the number of deaths per day would look like if the plague was mainly spread by rats and fleas on the green line, coughs and sneezes on the blue line, and human fleas and body lice on the red line. They compared this to the real number of deaths per day. And what did they find? Well, in 7 out of 9 cases, they said it was more likely that the plague was being spread by human fleas and body lice, not by rats with fleas. In other words, the plague in these outbreaks was mainly being spread human to human via clothes, goods, or textiles. But wait! Look at this. It further proves the innocence of the black rat. But how? Well, in 2022, Stenseth et al. Looked at climate and soil data from places that are known to have plague rats in the modern day to see if European conditions were ever similar. Because if they ever were, that would support the idea of rats with fleas being the main plague spreaders. But look at those maps. They're showing that in Europe, the conditions were never right for these plague-carrying rats to be hanging around long term. The red boxes are where those populations should have been. The red coloring is where they could have been. Notice how there's almost no overlap. This leaves us with basically 2 options about how the plague kept getting to Europe. Number 1, there may have been native European rodents where the disease was hanging around medium term, or number 2, the plague kept getting reintroduced from outside of Europe via human movements like trade routes. But when I say outside of Europe, you'd think I'd be talking about China, right? After all, that's the place where the plague originally came from, making its way along the Silk Road. Or is it? There's evidence that epidemics definitely happened in China in the mid-1300s, but there's actually no direct evidence of bubonic plague specifically. In fact, recent research places the origin of the disease somewhere else entirely. Look at this headstone. It reveals what may be the true origin of the Black Death. On it, an engraving in Syriac reading, "This is the tomb of the believer Sanmak. He died of pestilence." But it's not just him. There are at least 118 bodies buried in this former trading community, all dying from the same thing within a year of each other. The year, by the way, was 1338. The site of this event? Central Asia, more specifically Lake Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan, in a settlement called that. But what's so important about it? After all, the Russians had uncovered the stones in the 1880s, and no one had figured out what this pestilence was. Until 2022, that is, when Spiro et al. Exhumed 7 bodies from the settlement, did a bunch of science stuff, and figured out that Yersinia pestis, a bacteria that causes plague, was, oh, let me guess, clearly involved in their deaths? Well, yes. The mysterious pestilence in question was most likely plague, and this conclusion was backed by another interesting discovery, that a massive number of new plague strains had popped up in this region in a big bang of plague diversity at around the same time that the settlers had died. So the researchers' theory was this: there are large rodent populations in the Tian Shan mountains near the settlement, with those rodent populations being known carriers of plague-infected fleas. So in the early 14th century, the disease likely jumped from rodents, possibly marmots, to humans. But there's a problem. There were 8 whole years unaccounted for between this Kyrgyzstan outbreak and the beginning of the Black Death proper in the Black Sea region in 1346. There's also a 3,500 kilometer distance between the settlement and the Black Sea. How did the plague manage to travel all this way? Warfare, trade, military expeditions, and environmental factors are all listed as potential explanations, but we don't know for sure. We do know that by 1346, the plague had been brought to Europe, most likely by the Golden Horde during the Siege of Kaffa. But it wasn't just Europe that was impacted by the Black Death and subsequent plagues. It also devastated the Middle East and North Africa, including all of these places. Of course, wherever the plague went, you could be certain that it would bring chaos, that it killed at random, turning your survival into a dice roll. But hold on, was that really the case? Age, sex, health. For a long time, it was said that these things didn't matter, that the plague was an indiscriminate killer. Some accounts from the time took another angle, suggesting that the plague specifically targeted the young and strongly, commonly sparing the elderly and feeble. Recent research, though, has painted a very different picture. The plague often ended up killing more women than men. Pre-existing health conditions or compromised immune systems increased your chances of dying. Older adults were more likely to be claimed by the plague than younger people. This is really quite a different tale. Under this narrative, the Black Death killed the most frail people in society, and did it so quickly that life once again became survival of the fittest. And that's the opinion of the key person behind most of this research, by the way, Sharon DeWitt. So you'd think then that it was all bad. Nothing good ever came from the ashes, as it were. But I bring news. To get to the good news, though, we have to stop with the bad. Oh, look, it's the lords and landowners, and they're very sad that so many have died. Because with all those peasants dying, who's going to work the land now? You see, for generations, Europe had been under a system called feudalism, where many peasants were serfs, laborers who were required contractually to live and work on a piece of land in service to a landowner, called the lord of the manor. The work they did was mostly farming, but also mining, tax collecting, road maintenance, fun stuff. And when I say required to live and work, I really mean it. Serfs couldn't sell or leave their land. They couldn't choose who to marry or what job they wanted to do. Any decisions like that required the lord's permission. And here's the neat thing: if you were a serf, then your children were also contractually serfs, usually. But then the Black Death happened, tons of people died, and there ended up being a massive labor shortage. In other words, there just weren't enough people around to do the jobs that needed doing. Europe took 200 years for its population to recover, after all. This meant that labor became much more valuable, and the peasants weren't stupid. They came to realize their value. And this is where the good news comes in. Lords and landowners were forced to compete with each other and put in some actual effort to attract workers. Now they were offering fairer agreements to those who chose to work their land. Revolts! They happened, like the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. They didn't end serfdom, but they accelerated the process of peasants gaining more rights. By the 1500s, the unthinkable happened, and serfdom just wasn't that profitable or popular anymore in much of Western Europe. It became cheaper to just hire people as and when needed and pay them for their services. That way, you didn't have to pay the upkeep of people living on your land full time. So that wasn't every misconception about the Black Death. If you want some more, then let me know, and thank you for watching.